In March of 1897, a fire consumed the county courthouse in Willow Creek, Louisiana. Flames devoured decades of land deeds, birth certificates, and marriage licenses. But in the chaos, as clerks desperately salvaged what they could from the burning building, something unexpected emerged from a sealed iron box hidden behind a false wall in the basement archives. Inside were 47 letters written in children's handwriting. All were addressed to families who had lived in the area between 1848 and 1865. None had ever been sent, and every single one came from a place called Magnolia Ridge Plantation, a property that, according to official records, had been abandoned since 1866. What made the discovery truly disturbing was a detail noticed by the courthouse clerk, Harriet DuPont, as she carefully laid out the singed papers to dry. The letters weren't just from different children. They were written by children who shared the same names as others who had written years earlier, as if the same children had been writing for decades, long past any natural lifetime. The questions began immediately. Who had sealed these letters away? Why had a plantation listed as abandoned for over 30 years continued to receive correspondence from children who should have grown old or died? And most chilling of all, what had happened at Magnolia Ridge that someone wanted buried so thoroughly that they hid the evidence in a courthouse wall? This is the story of what those documents revealed and the truth they had concealed for generations. The history of Magnolia Ridge Plantation begins in the winter of 1832, when a wealthy merchant from Charleston named Victor Langley purchased 1,200 acres of rich bottomland along the Pearl River in southern Louisiana. Unlike most plantation owners of the era, Langley had made his fortune not through agriculture, but through shipping and trade. He had connections throughout the South and as far north as Philadelphia, and he used those connections to establish what he called an experimental agricultural enterprise. The plantation itself was unremarkable in many ways. It grew cotton, sugarcane, and indigo like dozens of others in the region. But from the beginning, there was something different about Magnolia Ridge, something that set it apart in the memories of those who lived nearby. It was the children. Every year, beginning in 1834, wagons would arrive at Magnolia Ridge carrying children. Not infants, but children aged roughly 5 to 12 years old. They came from orphanages in New Orleans, Charleston, and Savannah. They came from poorhouses in Mobile and Natchez. Some arrived with small cloth bags containing their only possessions. Others had nothing at all. The official explanation, documented in parish records, was that Langley had established a charitable apprenticeship program. The children would learn agricultural skills, receive food and shelter, and eventually be placed with families throughout the region who needed labor. It was presented as an act of Christian generosity, saving children from the streets and giving them a future. Local residents thought it was admirable. The parish priest, Father Antoine Broussard, even praised Langley publicly in his Easter sermon of 1836, calling him a man who extends God's mercy to the forgotten. But there were whispers too, quiet observations that never quite formed into accusations. The plantation workers, both enslaved people and the few white overseers, noticed that the children who arrived at Magnolia Ridge were never seen working in the fields. They weren't taught to pick cotton or cut cane. They didn't appear at the quarters where enslaved families lived. They were housed separately in a long, low building at the far eastern edge of the property, surrounded by a tall fence covered in climbing magnolia vines. The building was called the Children's House. No one from outside the plantation was permitted to enter it. When supply wagons delivered goods to Magnolia Ridge, drivers were instructed to leave children's provisions, clothing, books, paper, medicine, at the gate. The items would be collected after the wagons departed. Even the plantation doctor, a man named Thomas Garrett, who treated both enslaved workers and white overseers for illnesses and injuries, was never called to the Children's House. "If a child takes ill, we manage it ourselves," Langley told him once, with a smile that Garrett later described as pleasant but final. There was something else, too. Something that should have raised more questions but somehow didn't at the time. The children never left. According to the records Langley submitted to the parish each year, children were regularly placed with families or apprenticed to craftsmen in surrounding counties. The paperwork was meticulous. Names, dates, destinations. Everything looked legitimate. But no one in Willow Creek or the neighboring towns could remember actually seeing children from Magnolia Ridge being taken away to new homes. No one recalled families arriving to collect them. It was as if they simply vanished into the children's house and then, on paper, reappeared somewhere else entirely. In 1842, a woman named Dorothy Hinton traveled from Natchez to Magnolia Ridge. Her younger sister, a girl named Emma, had been sent to the plantation 2 years earlier from a Natchez orphanage after their mother died of fever. Dorothy had saved money from working as a seamstress and wanted to visit Emma, perhaps even take her back to Natchez if Langley would permit it. She was turned away at the main gate. Langley met her personally, dressed in an impeccable gray suit, his manner cordial but immovable. He explained that Emma had already been placed with a family in Baton Rouge, a kind couple who owned a dry goods store and needed help minding their younger children. He showed Dorothy a document with official-looking seals. He even offered to write to the family on her behalf. Dorothy accepted the letter and returned to Natchez reassured. But 3 months later, when she received no reply, she wrote directly to the parish clerk in Baton Rouge, asking for information about any dry goods stores that might employ a girl named Emma Hinton. The clerk responded that no such business existed, and no family by the name Langley had provided could be found in the parish records. Dorothy wrote to Langley demanding answers. She received no response. She wrote to the sheriff of Willow Creek. Her letter was filed but never investigated. Years later, in the documents discovered after the courthouse fire, investigators found Dorothy's original complaint, stamped with a single notation in faded ink. Matter resolved. Petitioner satisfied. There was no record of any resolution, and no evidence Dorothy Hinton had ever written again. Now here's what you need to understand about Magnolia Ridge to appreciate what came next. The plantation wasn't isolated. It stood along a relatively well-traveled road between Willow Creek and the river docks. People passed by it regularly. Merchants, travelers, riverboat workers. And yet for nearly 2 decades, no one truly questioned what happened behind that magnolia-covered fence. Part of the reason was Langley himself. He was careful. He contributed generously to local churches, sponsored community events, and made friends with influential men. He never drew attention to the children's house. He simply ran his plantation, paid his debts, and maintained the appearance of a benevolent, if private, gentleman. But there was another reason, darker and more human. People saw what they wanted to see. They preferred the story of the generous merchant saving orphans to the uncomfortable questions that might have followed if they looked closer. That willful blindness would haunt the region for generations. Now, if you're wondering how all of this connects to the letters found in 1897, the ones written by children decades after they should have grown up, we need to move forward to the year 1861. The Civil War changed everything in Louisiana, as it did across the South. Cotton prices collapsed, trade routes were severed. Plantations that had thrived for decades found themselves struggling to survive. Magnolia Ridge was no exception. Victor Langley, now in his 60s, continued to operate the plantation, though on a much smaller scale. Fewer wagons arrived with goods. Fewer workers remained on the land. But curiously, the wagons carrying children still came. Even in 1863, at the height of the war, when Union forces controlled New Orleans and supplies were scarce throughout the Confederacy, records show that at least 3 transports of children arrived at Magnolia Ridge from an orphanage in Mobile. Why would an orphanage in a city under siege send children hundreds of miles to a failing plantation in the middle of a war? That question would become central to the investigation decades later. In April of 1865, just days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Victor Langley died. The official cause, recorded by a traveling physician who happened to be passing through Willow Creek, was listed as apoplexy, what we would now call a stroke. He was found in his study, slumped over his desk, a pen still in his hand. The plantation passed to his nephew, a man named Marcus Langley, who lived in Mobile and had visited Magnolia Ridge only a handful of times. Marcus arrived in May of 1865 to survey his inheritance. What he found troubled him deeply, though the exact nature of his concerns wouldn't become clear until much later. He stayed at the plantation for exactly 6 days. During that time, according to testimony later given by one of the remaining overseers, Marcus spent hours in the children's house, examining records, speaking with the caretakers, and walking the grounds with a look of visible distress. On the 6th day, he locked the children's house, dismissed all remaining staff with severance pay, and left Magnolia Ridge. He never returned. In June of 1866, Marcus Langley sold the entire property, buildings, land, equipment, to a timber company based in Baton Rouge for a price far below market value. The sale contract included one unusual stipulation: the children's house and the acre of land surrounding it were to be left untouched. The building was to remain locked, and no one was to enter it for any reason. The timber company agreed. It was a strange request, but the land was valuable enough that they didn't argue. For the next 30 years, Magnolia Ridge Plantation ceased to exist as a working property. The fields grew wild. The main house slowly deteriorated. Timber crews cut down trees on the western sections of the land, but avoided the eastern edge where the children's house stood, now barely visible behind decades of unchecked magnolia growth. And there the story might have ended, lost to time and overgrowth, if not for the fire in 1897. When Harriet DuPont, the courthouse clerk, first examined the letters found in the iron box, she assumed they were simply old correspondence that had been misfiled. But as she read them, the strangeness began to reveal itself. The first letter was dated July 14th, 1848. It was written in a careful, childish hand on thin, yellowed paper. The letter read, "Dear Mama, I am at the plantation now. Mr. Langley says I will learn many things here and that you should not worry. The house is big and there are other children. We have lessons every day. I miss you. Please write to me. Your daughter, Sarah." Simple, heartbreaking in its innocence, but nothing particularly unusual. The second letter was also from a Sarah, dated November 3rd, 1852. "Dear Aunt Margaret, I have been here 4 months now. Mr. Langley says I am progressing well in my studies. There are 15 of us in the house. We are not allowed outside the fence, but we have a garden. I would like to see you again. Please come visit. Your niece, Sarah." Harriet noticed the surname. Both Sarahs had written Sarah Colby. The third letter, dated March 19th, 1859, was also signed Sarah Colby. "Dear Father, I hope this letter finds you in good health. I have been studying mathematics and natural philosophy. Mr. Langley says I show great aptitude. I do not understand why I cannot receive letters from you, but I am told the postal routes are unreliable. I remain your loving daughter, Sarah." Harriet laid the 3 letters side by side. The handwriting was different, clearly written by different people. The circumstances described were different, but the name was the same, and the tone of each letter held the same unsettling quality: polite, educated, completely unaware that anything was wrong. As Harriet continued through the letters, the pattern became undeniable. There were multiple letters signed by children named Thomas Reed, spanning 1850 to 1864. Several from a Mary Brennan, written between 1853 and 1862. 4 from a boy named William Cross, dated across a 9-year period. Either the same children had been writing for impossibly long stretches of their childhoods without ever aging beyond 12 or 13, or, the more disturbing possibility, different children were being given the same identities, one after another, writing letters to families who had no idea their own children had been replaced. Harriet DuPont brought the letters to the attention of the parish sheriff, a man named Louis Devereux. Devereaux, nearing retirement and accustomed to routine property disputes and minor thefts, initially dismissed the discovery as a clerical oddity. But Harriet was persistent. She compiled the letters by name and date, creating a chronological record that was impossible to ignore. Reluctantly, Sheriff Devereaux agreed to investigate. His first step was to track down Marcus Langley, who had inherited the plantation and sold it in 1866. Marcus was now 71 years old, living in a modest home in Mobile. When Devereaux's deputy contacted him by telegram, requesting information about the Children's House at Magnolia Ridge, Marcus responded immediately. His telegram was brief. "Do not open that building. Burn it to the ground. Some truths are better left buried." Naturally, this did the opposite of discouraging investigation. It confirmed that something deeply wrong had occurred at Magnolia Ridge, and that Marcus Langley knew exactly what it was. Sheriff Devereaux organized a party of 6 men: himself, 2 deputies, the parish clerk, a local physician named Dr. Raymond Fisher, and a journalist from the Willow Creek Gazette named Jonathan Webb. On a gray morning in April 1897, they rode out to the remains of Magnolia Ridge Plantation. What they found there would change how the entire region understood its own history. The Children's House stood exactly where the old property maps indicated, though it was nearly invisible beneath 30 years of overgrowth. Magnolia vines had completely engulfed the structure, climbing over the roof and walls, creating a living shroud. The fence that had once surrounded it had collapsed in places, swallowed by vegetation. The building itself was constructed of brick and cypress wood, built to last. A single story, perhaps 80 feet long and 30 feet deep, with a row of narrow windows along each side. All the windows were shuttered from the inside. The front door was secured with a heavy iron padlock, rusted but still intact. Sheriff Devereaux broke it open with a pry bar. The smell that emerged when the door swung open was overwhelming. Not of decay, but of mustiness, of air that had been sealed away for decades. Dust hung thick in the shaft of light that cut through the doorway. The men hesitated, then stepped inside. What they saw stopped them cold. The interior of the Children's House was a single long room, divided by wooden partitions into smaller sections. But it wasn't the architecture that shocked them. It was the fact that everything, furniture, papers, personal belongings, had been left exactly as it was the day the building was locked. There were rows of small wooden beds, each with a neatly folded blanket. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books, slates, and writing materials. A long table ran down the center of the room, set with tin cups and plates as if waiting for a meal that never came. Children's clothing hung on pegs. Shoes were lined up beneath the beds, arranged by size. It looked like a schoolroom, or perhaps a dormitory. Orderly, almost peaceful. But the details told a different story. Dr. Fisher, examining the room carefully, noted that the windows were not just shuttered, they were nailed shut from the outside. The door had been the only way in or out, and there were no personal items. No dolls, no toys, no letters from family. Nothing that suggested these children had any connection to a life beyond these walls. Jonathan Webb, the journalist, moved to the far end of the room where a heavy wooden cabinet stood against the wall. He opened it and found what would become the most important discovery of the investigation: a complete record system, meticulously maintained, documenting every child who had passed through Magnolia Ridge from 1834 to 1865. The ledgers were organized by year. Each entry included a child's original name, age at arrival, physical description, and origin. But beside many entries was a second notation, written in a different hand, reassigned. And next to that, a new name: Emma Hinton. The girl whose sister Dorothy had come searching for in 1842 was listed as arriving in June of 1840, age 8, from Natchez Orphan Asylum. Beside her name, reassigned, Sarah Colby, June 1840. The Sarah Colby, who had originally arrived in 1835, a different child entirely, was marked with a single word in the margin: graduated. The investigators stood in silence, piecing together what the ledgers revealed. Children arrived at Magnolia Ridge with their own names and identities. Those identities were then stripped away and replaced. A child who arrived as Emma became Sarah. Another who arrived as Ruth became Mary. And when a child graduated, a term that appeared again and again in the records, they were replaced by a new child who assumed their identity. It was a system of serial replacement, operating continuously for over 30 years. But the most disturbing question remained unanswered. What did graduated mean? Where did those children go? The ledgers provided no explanation. The last entry in the final volume was dated March 1865, listing a boy named Peter who had arrived from a mobile orphanage. Beside his name, reassigned, Thomas Reed. And then, in the margin, a notation that appeared nowhere else in the records. Final rotation. Program concluding. Sheriff Devereaux ordered the rest of the building searched thoroughly. In a smaller room behind the main hall, they found additional documents, lesson plans, daily schedules, dietary records, and medical logs. Everything was detailed and methodical, as if the children's house operated with the precision of a military institution. The medical logs were particularly revealing. They documented regular physical examinations of each child, tracking height, weight, vision, and general health. But they also included notations that seemed strange and out of place. Subject displays optimal learning retention, growth rate within expected parameters, behavioral conditioning effective. The language was clinical, detached. It didn't describe children. It described specimens. Dr. Fisher, reading through the logs with growing horror, made an observation that would reframe the entire investigation. He pointed to a set of medical entries from 1856, documenting a girl named Mary Brennan, one of the names from the courthouse letters. The logs tracked her health meticulously for 8 years, from age 7 to 15. But the letters signed by Mary Brennan, discovered in the courthouse, were all written in the handwriting of a child no older than 10 or 11. If the same Mary had been writing those letters across 8 years, her handwriting should have matured. It should have shown the development of an adolescent, then a young woman. It didn't. Every letter was written in the same childish script. The conclusion was inescapable. The Mary Brennan who wrote in 1856 was not the same Mary Brennan who wrote in 1862. Just as the ledgers indicated, when one child graduated, another arrived to take her place, and her name. But why? What possible reason could there be for such an elaborate deception? Jonathan Webb found the answer in a locked drawer of a desk in what appeared to be an office area. Inside were contracts, legal agreements between Victor Langley and various institutions across the South. Orphanages, poorhouses, charitable societies. The contracts were all variations of the same arrangement. The institutions would provide children to Magnolia Ridge for educational and agricultural training. In exchange, Langley would pay a quarterly fee to each institution. But there was a second set of contracts, hidden beneath the first. These were between Langley and wealthy families in Charleston, Savannah, Mobile, and New Orleans. The agreements were written in deliberately vague language, but the intent was clear. Langley would provide these families with educated and conditioned servants at regular intervals, young people who had been prepared for household service through comprehensive training. The families paid substantial sums for this service. The contract specified that the servants provided would be between ages 14 and 16, literate, obedient, and without family connections or legal encumbrances. Sheriff Devereaux read the contracts twice, trying to process what they meant. Then the full picture came into focus. Magnolia Ridge wasn't an orphanage or a school. It was a processing facility. Children arrived young, were stripped of their identities, trained and conditioned for years, and then sold as domestic servants to wealthy families who wanted workers without the legal complications of slavery or the emotional complications of hiring someone with a family who might come looking for them. The identity swapping served two purposes. First, it created a paper trail showing that children were constantly being placed with families which satisfied any oversight from authorities. Second, it ensured that if anyone came looking for a specific child, like Dorothy searching for Emma, Langley could truthfully say that child had left the plantation years ago, even if the person currently using that name was someone else entirely. The children who graduated were the ones who had completed their training. They were sent to the families who had contracted for them, given new identities yet again, and absorbed into households where they would work for years, possibly their entire lives, without any legal protection or family to advocate for them. It was trafficking, disguised as charity, and it had operated for over 3 decades, hiding in plain sight, protected by bureaucracy, politeness, and people's willingness not to ask difficult questions. The men stood in the silent, dust-filled children's house, surrounded by the evidence of what had happened there, and felt the weight of a terrible realization. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of children had passed through this building, had their lives stolen, and vanished into servitude with no one to remember their real names. But the investigation was far from over, because there was still one question the documents hadn't answered. The letters found in the courthouse were dated between 1848 and 1865. They had been sealed in a wall, never sent to the families they were addressed to. Who had hidden them, and why? Sheriff Devereaux's team spent the next week combing through every document at the children's house. They cataloged ledgers, contracts, medical records, and lesson plans. They sketched maps of the building's layout. They photographed everything, creating a permanent record. But it was in the cellar beneath the children's house that they found what would become the most haunting piece of the puzzle. The cellar entrance was hidden beneath a large rug in the office area, a wooden trapdoor, locked from above. When they pried it open and descended the narrow stairs, they found a small underground room, perhaps 15 feet square, with brick walls and a dirt floor. The room was empty except for 3 things. The first was a wooden filing cabinet containing duplicates of every letter the children had written. Hundreds of them, organized by the false names the children had been assigned. The letters were Lian Shi, training exercises. The children had been taught to write to imaginary families, to practice the identities they'd been given, to make those false lives feel real through repetition. The second was a journal, written in Victor Langley's own hand. It wasn't a diary of personal thoughts, but an operational record, a manual describing the methodology of what he called the program. Langley had created a system based on principles he'd observed in orphanages and workhouses during his travels through Europe in the 1820s. He believed that children between the ages of 5 and 12 were most malleable, most capable of being reformed into ideal servants. Too young and they were difficult to train. Too old, and they retained too much memory of their former lives, making them unreliable. The program worked in cycles. Children arrived and were immediately given new identities, names carefully chosen to match the region and era, designed to seem unremarkable. They were taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and household skills. But they were also subjected to what Langley called conditioning, a system of rewards and punishments designed to eliminate independent thought and create absolute obedience. The journal described it in chilling detail. Children who questioned instructions were isolated. Those who cried for their families were denied meals. Cooperation was rewarded with better food, small privileges, kind words. Over months and years, the children learned that compliance brought comfort, while resistance brought suffering. By the time they graduated, usually after 6 to 8 years in the program, they had been transformed into exactly what Langley's clients wanted: young people with useful skills, no family ties, and a deeply ingrained habit of obedience. The journal made no mention of physical cruelty. There were no descriptions of beatings or torture. Instead, it described a methodical psychological process, carried out with the same precision one might use to train an animal or cultivate a plant. The coldness of the language was perhaps more disturbing than outright violence would have been. But the journal also revealed something else. Something that explained why Marcus Langley had locked the building and walked away in horror. In entries from late 1864 and early 1865, Victor Langley's writing became erratic. The neat, controlled prose gave way to rambling observations and strange justifications. He wrote about the war, about the collapse of the social order, about his fear that the program would be discovered and he would face prosecution. And then, in an entry dated February 1865, just 2 months before his death, he wrote something that made the investigators' blood run cold. The final rotation is complete. 23 children remain. I cannot release them. They know too much. And the families who were to receive them have withdrawn their contracts due to the war. I cannot keep them. Supplies are exhausted, and I am too old to continue the work. There is only one solution, though it grieves me. They will be transferred to the secondary location as planned. The program must conclude without evidence. God forgive me. Secondary location. The third thing found in the cellar explained what that meant. On the eastern wall of the underground room, partially hidden behind the filing cabinet, was a crude map drawn in chalk. It showed the layout of Magnolia Ridge Plantation, with the main house, the fields, the quarters, and the children's house all marked. But at the far northeastern corner of the property, in an area marked as dense swampland, there was a symbol, a small rectangle labeled simply SL. Secondary location. Sheriff Devereaux felt a sick certainty settling in his stomach. He knew what they were going to find. 2 days later, the investigative team, now expanded to include the parish coroner and 3 additional deputies, made their way through the overgrown northeastern section of the former plantation. The land there was low and marshy, prone to flooding, dense with cypress and tupelo trees. It was land no one would ever farm or build on, land where something could be hidden and forgotten. It took them 4 hours of searching, wading through ankle-deep water and pushing through thick vegetation before they found it. A clearing, roughly 30 feet across, on a slight rise that kept it above the waterline. The ground there was different, disturbed, settled in a way that suggested it had been dug and refilled. And at the center of the clearing stood a stone marker, weathered and covered in moss, with a single word carved into its surface. The coroner ordered the site excavated. Over the next 3 days, working carefully, the team uncovered what they had feared they would find. 23 graves, shallow, unmarked except for the single stone. The remains were examined by Dr. Fisher and the coroner. All were children or young adolescents, aged approximately 12 to 16 based on bone development. There was no evidence of violent trauma, no broken bones or signs of struggle. The positioning of the remains suggested they had been buried with care, laid out in rows, each wrapped in cloth. Chemical analysis of soil samples, conducted later by a chemist in Baton Rouge, detected trace amounts of morphine and laudanum, common medications of the era, both of which could be lethal in high doses. The conclusion was rendered carefully in the official report. The deceased appeared to have succumbed to deliberate administration of sedative substances, resulting in fatal respiratory depression. Time of death estimated between late 1864 and early 1865, consistent with documented records. In plain language, they had been poisoned. Quietly, painlessly perhaps, but murdered nonetheless. Victor Langley, facing the collapse of his operation and unable to release the children who knew the truth about the program, had killed them. He had ended their lives as methodically as he had controlled them and buried them in the swamp where no one would find them. And then he had returned to his study, continued his correspondence, and died 2 months later, taking the secret with him. The investigation might have ended there, with a clear, if horrifying, explanation, if not for the insight of Jonathan Webb, the journalist who had accompanied Sheriff Devereaux to Magnolia Ridge. Webb had been reviewing the letters found in the courthouse, comparing them to the graves discovered at the plantation. The numbers didn't match. The graves accounted for 23 children. But the letters, the ledgers and the contracts suggested that hundreds of children had passed through Magnolia Ridge over 3 decades. Even accounting for the ones who had been successfully sold into service through the program, there should have been more recent arrivals, children who had come in 1862, 1863, 1864, during the war years when the operation was supposedly winding down. Where were they? Webb returned to the children's house and spent 2 full days searching every inch of the building. He examined floorboards, walls, and ceilings. He checked for hidden compartments or false walls. He found nothing. Then he had a different thought. He went back to the ledgers and looked specifically at the entries from 1861 onward, the war years. He noticed something he'd missed before. The handwriting changed. From 1834 to 1860, all entries in the ledgers were in the same neat, controlled script, Victor Langley's writing. But starting in 1861, a second hand appeared, making entries alongside Langley's. The writing was less refined, more hurried, but still methodical. And in 1863, Langley's handwriting disappeared entirely. From that point until the final entry in March 1865, all records were kept by the second writer. Webb compared the handwriting to documents found in the office. He identified the second writer, a woman named Ruth Nolan, listed in Plantation records as the head caretaker of the children's house. She had worked at Magnolia Ridge since 1852, managing the day-to-day operations of the program, while Langley handled finances and contracts. If anyone knew what had happened to the children who arrived during the war years, the ones who weren't in the graves, it would be Ruth Nolan. Webb spent the next month tracking her down. It wasn't easy. Ruth Nolan had left Louisiana after the plantation closed and vanished into the chaos of Reconstruction. But through property records, census documents, and patient correspondence with clerks across 3 states, Webb eventually found her. She was living in Beaumont, Texas, under the name Ruth Davis. She was 78 years old, working as a housekeeper for a widow. When Webb located her in June of 1897 and explained why he'd come, she went silent for a long moment. Then she said, "I wondered when someone would finally ask." Ruth Nolan's testimony, given over 3 days in a Beaumont boarding house and recorded by a stenographer Webb had hired, provided the missing pieces of the story. She had been 19 years old when Victor Langley hired her in 1852. She'd been working as a maid in New Orleans, struggling to support herself after her father died. Langley offered good wages, room and board, and work that he described as caring for and educating unfortunate children. It seemed like an opportunity. She arrived at Magnolia Ridge expecting to find an orphanage. Instead, she found the program. At first, she told herself it wasn't so different from any workhouse or apprenticeship system. Children were being trained for positions in service. Wasn't that better than leaving them on the streets? But over the months and years, the reality wore down her justifications. She saw children arrive frightened and confused, calling out for parents or siblings they'd been separated from. She watched as they were methodically broken down through isolation and manipulation. She witnessed the moments when a child's resistance finally collapsed, when they stopped asking when they could go home and simply accepted their new name, their new life, their new purpose. "I told myself I was keeping them safe," Ruth said, her voice barely above a whisper, as the stenographer's pen scratched across the page. "I made sure they were fed, that they stayed healthy. I taught them to read. I thought that was enough. I thought I was doing the right thing." But in 1861, when the war began, everything changed. The contracts dried up. The wealthy families who had purchased Langley's servants were dealing with their own crises, sons going to war, fortunes collapsing, households in turmoil. No one was buying anymore. But the orphanages, desperate and overcrowded, kept sending children. They had nowhere else to put them. By 1863, there were over 60 children at the children's house, far more than the facility was designed to hold. Supplies were scarce. Food was rationed. Langley, struggling to manage his failing plantation, spent less and less time dealing with the program. The responsibility fell almost entirely to Ruth. And then, in August of 1863, Langley made a decision that Ruth had been dreading. He told her to stop accepting new children. The ones already at Magnolia Ridge would remain until the war ended and contracts could be resumed, but no more would arrive. Ruth objected. She knew what happened to children in overcrowded orphanages during wartime: disease, starvation, neglect. Magnolia Ridge, for all its darkness, at least kept children alive and fed. Langley dismissed her concerns. The program was financially unsustainable. It was ending. So Ruth made a choice. She continued to accept children sent to Magnolia Ridge, but she didn't record them in the ledgers. She didn't tell Langley they'd arrived. Instead, she created a separate arrangement. There was a community of free black families living in the woods northeast of the plantation, near the swampland. People who had purchased their freedom or escaped slavery decades earlier and established a hidden settlement. Ruth had known about them for years. The plantation's enslaved workers traded with them occasionally, and Ruth had helped deliver supplies to them during particularly harsh winters. She approached the community's elder, a woman named Judith, and made a desperate proposal. Would they take the children who arrived, hide them, raise them, give them a chance at a life beyond the program? Judith agreed, but with conditions. The children would be absorbed into the community, but they could never leave. The settlement's existence depended on secrecy. If word got out, if authorities discovered free black families living independently in the woods, they would be scattered, possibly re-enslaved or driven out. The children would have to become part of that secrecy. From late 1863 until early 1865, Ruth smuggled 18 children out of Magnolia Ridge. When wagons arrived with new orphans, she would accept them, provide them with food and rest, and then, in the dead of night, lead them through the swamp to the settlement. Judith's community took them in, gave them new names, real names chosen by the children themselves when possible, and integrated them into their families. "Those 18 are the only souls I managed to save," Ruth told Webb, tears running down her weathered face. "The others, God help me, I couldn't do anything for them." She had been there, at Magnolia Ridge, when Victor Langley made his final decision about the 23 children who remained. She had tried to argue with him, begged him to release them, or let her find homes for them. Langley refused. They knew too much. They could expose the program. And he was too ill, too tired, too broken by the collapse of everything he'd built to deal with the consequences. Ruth wasn't present when he administered the laudanum. She didn't help bury them in the swamp, but she knew. And she had stayed silent, paralyzed by guilt and fear until Marcus Langley arrived and shut down the plantation forever. "Marcus knew," she said. "He found his uncle's journal just like you did. He read what had been done, and he made the choice to bury it all, lock the building, sell the land, walk away. He thought that was mercy. Maybe it was. I don't know anymore." Jonathan Webb asked her the question that mattered most. Did she know what had happened to the children who had been sold through the program? Could any of them be found, their true identities restored? Ruth shook her head slowly. They're lost, scattered across the South, living under false names in families who likely never told them the truth of how they came to be there. Some might still be alive, old men and women now believing the lies they were taught as children. Or maybe they figured it out years ago and chose to keep silent, because what good would the truth do them now? She paused, then added, "The ones I saved, the 18 in the settlement, they have families now. Children, grandchildren. They built lives. If you go looking for them, if you expose them, you'll destroy what they've created. Please, let them be." Webb promised he would keep the settlement's location secret. And he did. His final article, published in newspapers across Louisiana and picked up by regional papers as far as Atlanta and Richmond, detailed the horrors of Magnolia Ridge, but made no mention of the hidden community or the children Ruth had smuggled to safety. Instead, his article focused on a different kind of exposure: the complicity of institutions, authorities, and ordinary people who had allowed the program to operate for 30 years without intervention. The aftermath of the Magnolia Ridge revelations was swift and widespread. The orphanages and charitable societies named in Langley's contracts faced public outrage. Several were investigated, their directors forced to resign. Records were audited, revealing that many institutions had sent children to Magnolia Ridge even after receiving complaints from families who could never locate their relatives. The families who had purchased servants through the program were more difficult to hold accountable. Many of the contracts had been destroyed. Some of the families had died or moved away. Those who were confronted either denied knowledge of the arrangement or claimed they had believed the young people they employed had come through legitimate apprenticeship channels. No one was ever prosecuted. The crimes had occurred decades earlier, the primary perpetrator was dead, and the legal framework of the time made it nearly impossible to bring charges for what amounted to exploitation that existed in a gray area between legal servitude and outright trafficking. But the social consequences were real. Families named in the investigation faced ostracism. Businesses failed. Reputations were destroyed. The story of Magnolia Ridge became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what could happen when vulnerable people, especially children, were treated as commodities rather than human beings. The 23 children found in the mass grave were given a proper burial in the Willow Creek Cemetery. A monument was erected with a simple inscription, "In memory of the children of Magnolia Ridge." Their names were taken, but they are not forgotten. The Children's House itself was demolished in 1898. The timber company that owned the land wanted no association with what had happened there. The bricks were scattered, the wood burned, the foundation filled in. Within a year, the site was indistinguishable from the surrounding swamp. Jonathan Webb's articles were eventually collected and published as a book in 1899, The Hidden Children, an investigation into the Magnolia Ridge plantation scandal. It sold modestly, read mostly by reformers and activists who used it as evidence in their campaigns for child welfare legislation. And then, gradually, the story faded. Other scandals emerged, other tragedies demanded attention. By the 1920s, Magnolia Ridge was remembered only by historians and a few elderly residents of Willow Creek who had lived through the investigation. But there was one more chapter to the story. One final piece that wouldn't be discovered until decades later, long after everyone directly involved had died. In 1954, a graduate student named Alice Porter was conducting research for her master's thesis on Reconstruction-era Louisiana. She was examining property records in the Baton Rouge archives when she came across the 1866 sale contract for Magnolia Ridge Plantation. Something about it caught her attention. The stipulation that the Children's House and surrounding acre be left untouched. She knew the basic history of the scandal. It was a footnote in Louisiana history texts by then. But she was curious about why Marcus Langley had included that clause. Following a hunch, she tracked down Marcus Langley's estate records. He had died in 1904, leaving his modest possessions to a nephew. But among the items listed in the estate inventory was a sealed envelope, marked "Not to be opened until 50 years after my death." 1954 was exactly 50 years after Marcus Langley's death. Alice Porter contacted the descendant who had inherited Marcus's papers and explained what she'd found. The descendant, a man named Robert Langley living in Atlanta, had been unaware of his family's connection to Magnolia Ridge. He was horrified when Alice explained the history, but he agreed to open the envelope in the presence of witnesses. Inside was a letter written in Marcus Langley's hand, dated May 1866. The letter was addressed "To whom it may concern," and constituted a confession of sorts. Marcus explained that when he had arrived at Magnolia Ridge after his uncle's death, he had discovered not just the evidence of the program, but something his uncle's journal hadn't mentioned. The 18 children Ruth Nolan claimed to have saved, the ones she had smuggled to the hidden settlement, had never actually left the plantation. Ruth had lied to protect herself. The settlement existed, and Judith's community was real, but they had refused to take the children. The risk was too great, the timing too dangerous. They had their own families to protect and couldn't absorb 18 additional mouths to feed during a time of war and scarcity. Ruth, desperate and with nowhere else to turn, had made an impossible decision. She had told the children they were being taken to safety, led them into the swamp on the pretext of escape, and then, unable to go through with anything more terrible, had simply left them there with what supplies she could carry, hoping they would find their way to freedom. They hadn't. Marcus's letter described finding the evidence during his 6 days at the plantation. Belongings scattered in the swamp, remnants of a makeshift camp. He had searched but found no trace of the children themselves, no remains, no indication of what had become of them. He concluded they had either died of exposure, drowned in the marshes, or, the possibility he found most unbearable, survived long enough to suffer far worse fates. He couldn't prove what had happened. He couldn't bring them back, so he made the choice to seal the children's house, sell the land with the stipulation that the building never be disturbed, and carry the weight of the knowledge alone. "I chose silence because I could not bear to add to the horror," Marcus wrote. "My uncle's crimes were already exposed. What good would it do to reveal that even the small mercy we believed had occurred, the saving of 18 children, was itself a lie? Let Ruth Nolan live with her conscience. Let the dead rest. Let this truth die with me." But he had also written the letter, sealed it with instructions to open it 50 years later, suggesting that some part of him believed the truth mattered more than comfort. Alice Porter included Marcus's letter in her thesis. It was published by a small academic press in 1956 and largely ignored outside of historical circles. The revelation that Ruth Nolan's testimony had been partially false did little to change the fundamental understanding of what had happened at Magnolia Ridge. The crimes remained the same. The victims remained dead. The additional detail was simply another layer of tragedy on an already tragic story. But it did answer one final question that had lingered since the original investigation. The letters found sealed in the courthouse wall, the ones that had started the entire investigation, had been hidden there by Ruth Nolan herself. A clerk who had worked at the courthouse in the 1880s, before the fire, came forward after reading Alice Porter's thesis. He remembered Ruth, who had briefly worked as a cleaning woman at the courthouse in 1881. She had access to the building, including the basement archives. She must have placed the iron box behind the false wall during that time, ensuring the letters would eventually be found, even if she couldn't bring herself to expose the truth directly while she was alive. It was her way of confessing without facing the consequences. A coward's confession, perhaps, but a confession nonetheless. The courthouse fire in 1897 had been accidental, but it had accomplished what Ruth Nolan had hoped for. It forced the truth into the open 16 years after she had hidden the evidence, and 7 years after her own death in 1890. Today, the land that was once Magnolia Ridge Plantation is part of a state wildlife preserve. The swamps have reclaimed almost everything. Hikers occasionally visit the area, unaware of what lies beneath the cypress and water. The monument to the 23 children still stands in Willow Creek Cemetery, though it's weathered now, the inscription difficult to read. A historical marker was placed near the site of the former plantation in 1976, describing the basic facts of the scandal in carefully neutral language. But the full story, the ledgers, the contracts, the letters, Ruth Nolan's testimony, Marcus Langley's confession, exists only in archives. Academic papers reference it. Occasionally, a documentary filmmaker or podcast host discovers it and brings it to public attention again, briefly, before it fades back into the background of history. The children themselves remain mostly nameless. Some of their original identities were recovered from orphanage records and cross-referenced with the Magnolia Ridge ledgers, but many of the institutions involved had destroyed or lost their own documentation. For dozens of children, there is no record of who they were before they arrived at the plantation, and the ones who were sold through the program, who lived out their lives under false identities in households across the South, are impossible to trace. They're buried under names that were never truly theirs, their real selves erased as completely as if they had never existed. There is, however, one strange footnote to the story that emerged in the 1970s during the construction of a highway expansion near the old Plantation site. Construction crews, excavating through swampland to lay foundation for a bridge, discovered fragments of children's belongings scattered across a wide area of the marsh, pieces of clothing, a few buttons, a rusted tin cup, a child's shoe. The items were dated by archaeologists to the 1860s, consistent with the timeline of Ruth Nolan's smuggling operation. But they also found something else. Carved into the bark of an ancient cypress tree, preserved beneath layers of overgrowth, were names. Dozens of them, first names only, scratched into the wood in childish lettering. Emma, Ruth, Peter, James, Catherine, William, Sarah. Some matched names from the Magnolia Ridge ledgers. Others didn't appear in any records at all. It's impossible to know who carved them, or when, or why. Maybe it was the children Ruth claimed to have saved, marking their presence before they disappeared into the swamp. Maybe it was children from the program during brief moments outside the children's house, claiming some small piece of identity by carving their real names where they thought no one would see. Or maybe the interpretation favored by the archaeologist who documented the find. It was a memorial. Children who knew they would be forgotten, leaving the only trace of themselves they could. The tree was cut down during the highway construction. A section of the trunk, with the carved names still visible, was preserved, and is now housed in the Louisiana State Museum in Baton Rouge. It's displayed in a small exhibit on child welfare history, rarely visited, easy to overlook among the larger narratives of Louisiana's past. But the names are still there, carved deep enough that time and rot couldn't erase them. And in a sense, that's the legacy of Magnolia Ridge. Not the scandal, not the investigation, not even the graves in the swamp, but the stubborn persistence of those names, refusing to be forgotten, even when everything else, identities, families, futures, had been stripped away. The children of Magnolia Ridge were hidden for generations. Their suffering was concealed behind pleasant lies and bureaucratic efficiency. But the truth, like those carved names, had a way of surviving. It waited in sealed iron boxes and hidden journals. It rested in mass graves and chalk maps on cellar walls. And eventually, when fire and curiosity and the passage of time aligned, it surfaced. Not to bring justice. Justice was impossible for crimes so old and perpetrators so long dead. But to bear witness. To say that it happened, that it mattered, and that the children who passed through those gates and into that magnolia-shrouded building were real. Their names were taken. But they are not forgotten. If you've made it this far into this story, take a moment to like this video. These historical investigations take weeks of research to bring to you, and your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. The question that haunts historians who study the Magnolia Ridge case isn't really about what happened. The documents make that clear enough. The question is how many other places like it existed. Victor Langley wasn't an anomaly. He was simply one man who created a system to exploit a vulnerability that existed throughout the 19th century. The vulnerability of children without families, without advocates, without anyone to notice when they disappeared. Orphanages and poorhouses operated with minimal oversight. Children were routinely placed out or apprenticed to adults with little investigation into whether those placements were legitimate. If a child vanished from an institution's records, there was rarely anyone to ask why. And if someone did ask, a forged document or a plausible lie was often enough to satisfy them. How many other Victor Langleys were operating in the shadows of the 1800s? How many other programs, hidden behind charitable facades, treated children as resources to be processed and sold? The Magnolia Ridge documents provide a rare window into one such operation, preserved by accident and discovered by chance. But the very fact that it remained hidden for so long, protected by locked doors, sealed boxes, and people's reluctance to confront uncomfortable truths, suggests that other stories remain buried still. In parish records across Louisiana, researchers have since found hints of similar patterns. Orphanages with unusually high placement rates and no follow-up documentation. Charitable institutions funded by wealthy donors whose business records show payments for household staff acquisition. Property transfers with strange stipulations about buildings that must remain locked or land that must stay undisturbed. None as thoroughly documented as Magnolia Ridge. None that led to mass graves or revealed such a methodical system. But enough to suggest that Langley's program wasn't unique, just uniquely well documented. That's the truly disturbing legacy of this story. Not that it happened, but that it was allowed to happen, and that it likely happened elsewhere in ways we'll never fully uncover. There's one more detail worth sharing before we close this investigation. Something that didn't make it into Jonathan Webb's original articles or Alice Porter's thesis, but was recorded in the personal notes of Sheriff Devereaux. During the excavation of the mass grave in 1897, the coroner documented each set of remains carefully, creating detailed records of bone measurements, dental structures, and any identifying characteristics. Among the 23 children, one stood out. The skeleton was that of a girl, approximately 14 years old, buried with slightly more care than the others. She had been wrapped in a finer cloth and positioned with her hands folded across her chest. Beside her, tucked into the cloth wrapping, was a small object that had survived the decades underground. It was a locket, tarnished silver, with a broken chain. Inside the locket was a tiny photograph, one of the earliest types, a daguerreotype, protected by the sealed case from complete deterioration. The image was badly faded, but still visible. A young girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, standing beside a woman. Both were dressed in simple but clean clothing, both looking directly at the camera with serious expressions. On the back of the locket, engraved in barely legible script, was a name: Catherine Elizabeth. Beloved daughter, Catherine Elizabeth. No surname. Just that. Sheriff Devereaux cross-referenced the name with the Magnolia Ridge ledgers. He found her. Catherine Elizabeth Hayes arrived from Charleston in 1856, age 7, from the Sisters of Mercy Orphanage, reassigned as Mary Brennan 2 weeks after arrival. The girl who had been stripped of her identity, trained and conditioned for 8 years, and then killed when she became an inconvenience, had been buried with the only proof of her real self that she had somehow managed to keep hidden: a locket with her true name and a photograph of the mother she had been taken from. How she had kept it secret through 8 years of the program, through inspections, through the stripping away of personal belongings, through the systematic erasure of her past, is unknown. But she had, and when she died, someone, perhaps Ruth Nolan, perhaps even Victor Langley, in a moment of unexpected humanity, had buried it with her. Sheriff Devereaux tried to locate Catherine's family in Charleston, hoping to at least inform them of what had happened to her. But the trail was cold. The orphanage had closed in 1871. Its records had been lost. The Hayes family, if they still existed, couldn't be found. Catherine Elizabeth Hayes, like so many of the children of Magnolia Ridge, remained lost. Except for that locket, and the photograph inside it, and the name engraved on the back. Small pieces of proof that she had been real, that she had been loved, and that she had fought in her own quiet way to remember who she was. The locket is now part of the collection at the Louisiana Historical Association, stored in a climate-controlled archive in New Orleans. It's been photographed, documented, and occasionally displayed in exhibits about child welfare history in America. And sometimes researchers who come across it in the archives pause and think about the girl who wore it, about the moment when her mother clasped it around her neck, never imagining it would become the only thing to survive her daughter's stolen life, about the strength it must have taken to hide it, year after year, through everything the program demanded. It's a small object, a piece of tarnished silver and a faded photograph. But in the story of Magnolia Ridge, where so much was destroyed and so many were forgotten, it stands as a testament to something that couldn't be completely erased. Identity, memory, the stubborn insistence even in the face of systematic erasure, that we are who we are, not what someone else decides we should be. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into America's hidden history. The final question, the one that people still ask when they encounter this story, is whether anything like Magnolia Ridge could happen today. The answer is both comforting and unsettling. The specific mechanisms that allowed Victor Langley's program to operate, the lack of oversight on orphanages, the absence of mandatory record-keeping, the legal ambiguity around child placement, have been largely eliminated in modern America. Child welfare systems, for all their flaws, have safeguards that didn't exist in the 19th century. But the underlying vulnerability that Langley exploited remains. Children without advocates, without people who will notice if they vanish, without voices that will be heard if they cry for help, still exist. The systems have changed, but the fundamental truth hasn't. When society decides certain people don't matter, when institutions prioritize convenience over conscience, when good people choose not to ask uncomfortable questions, terrible things become possible. Magnolia Ridge wasn't an aberration. It was an inevitability in a system that treated the vulnerable as disposable. And the documents that finally surfaced, the letters, the ledgers, the journals, the contracts, they didn't just reveal what happened at one plantation in Louisiana between 1834 and 1865. They revealed what happens anywhere, anytime. People in power decide that some lives are worth less than others. That's the real horror of this story, not ghosts or curses or supernatural evil. Just human choices made systematically, justified carefully, and hidden successfully until fire and time and a clerk's curiosity brought them into the light. The children of Magnolia Ridge deserved better than the lives they were given and the deaths they suffered. They deserved to grow up with their real names, to be remembered by people who loved them, to leave traces in the world beyond carved bark and sealed letters. We can't give them that now. All we can do is tell their story, speak their names when we know them, and remember that they were real. That has to be enough. Because the truth, once it surfaces, demands to be acknowledged. Even if it's a century late, even if justice is impossible, even if all we can offer is memory. The plantation is gone, the children are gone, but the documents remain, preserved in archives, accessible to anyone willing to look. And as long as those records exist, the children of Magnolia Ridge aren't completely forgotten. Their story at least survived. If this story affected you, share it. Let others know what was hidden for so long. And join us next time as we uncover another buried chapter of American history. The last known reference to Magnolia Ridge Plantation appeared in a brief newspaper article from 1982, when the Louisiana State Historical Society placed a marker at the wildlife preserve commemorating the site. The ceremony was small, a few historians, some local officials, a descendant of Sheriff Devereux, and one very old woman who approached the marker after the ceremony ended, stood silently for a long moment, and then placed a small bouquet of wildflowers at its base before walking away. A photographer from the local paper captured the moment. The woman was never identified, but researchers who later examined the photograph noticed something. She was holding a piece of paper, visible just at the edge of the frame, with writing on it. The text was too small to read in the photograph, but analysis suggested it might have been a letter. Whether she was connected to Magnolia Ridge, perhaps a descendant of the children Ruth Nolan had tried to save, or one of the survivors of the program living under a false identity, remains unknown. She never came forward. The flowers eventually wilted and were removed. And the mystery of who she was, and what her connection to the plantation might have been, became one more unanswered question in a story full of them. But maybe that's fitting. The story of Magnolia Ridge was always about the children who were hidden, the truths that were buried, and the traces that survived against all odds. If one more secret remains, one more piece of the puzzle that never quite fits into place, perhaps that's just the nature of history. We excavate what we can. We document what we find. We tell the stories that the evidence supports. And we accept That some things, some connections, some truths, some final pieces of understanding will always remain just out of reach, visible only in shadows and suggestions. The plantation that hid generations of children is gone now, reclaimed by the swamp that witnessed its darkest secrets. But the documents surfaced, the truth emerged, and the children, stolen and silenced and nearly forgotten, are remembered. Not perfectly, not completely, but remembered nonetheless. And in the end, after everything that was taken from them, perhaps that small act of remembrance is the only justice we can still provide.